even forgot our own name.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this analysis, I promise to tell you what Ernest Becker, the Pulitzer Prize-winning cultural anthropologist, says about self-esteem, what it is, what it does, why it matters, and what it really means to have it. If you've forgotten what low self-esteem looks like, what it feels like, and what people afflicted with it constantly say and do, may I recommend the movie Wanted from 2008.
This is the mind-numbing black hole I call a job. And this is me, Wesley Gibson. Nobody. Like everybody else, I just keep waiting for a lotto ticket out of my boring existence.
Wesley, a nobody, lives a purposeless life, has no money, a job that he hates, and suffers from acute attacks of anxiety. The movie also shows just how someone goes from being a nobody with no agency, no confidence, no purpose, to being powerful, actualized, and bursting with assertive agency. It's really quite straightforward, although if you get the wrong blueprint in this bursting forth of potential, you're headed for disaster as well. So if at any point in this analysis you feel Becker's sentiments, which are sometimes quite sophisticated, on self-esteem are going over your head, just get hold of Wanted. Just watch it and you'll get the picture. You'll get the general idea. I'll also provide some additional insight on the theme and the meaning of the film at the end of this analysis. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Bear in mind, I will be continuing this whole theme of self-esteem. Even though it's not very popular, I do think it is very important and meaningful, especially in this arena of true crime. It really does cut to the heart of true crime itself in ways that many of us don't realize and I think underestimate. If you're enjoying this analysis, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. Oh God, I struggle with low self-esteem all the time. I think everyone does. I have so much wrong with me, it's unbelievable. And that is a quote from Angelina Jolie. Ernest Becker guides us into the process of self-esteem by taking us to the very beginning. He describes an infant being nourished with self-esteem literally through the infusion of mother's milk. But this warm support, he says, eventually gives way as the child learns painfully that he cannot earn parental approval or self-esteem by continuing to express himself through his body. He finds instead that he must conduct himself through symbolic codes. Now, if you think about that in a more simple way, approval is in a sense self-esteem. When we get approval from others, we are getting, in a sense, esteem foisted upon us. Simply expressed, and this is a quote from Becker, self-value no longer derives from mother's milk, but from mother's mouth. This, of course, is the beginning for everyone who must transition to being validated and esteemed via a particular value system, which is both external and internalized, to the extent that any individual decides to be part, wants to be part, has to be part of a particular society, wants to belong to a particular community. How they are rated or reviewed by the society is subsequently measured in sounds, in words, but these sounds and words become just as essential as milk to the perceived sense of value and self-value, as Becker succinctly puts it. He writes, his feeling of human worth has become largely a linguistic contrivance. In other words, who we are comes to be derived from symbols. Now, if you think this is a very cerebral, sophisticated analysis, that it's something that is really difficult to understand, well, how do you feel when a comment that you make gets liked or shared, or there's a lot of interaction surrounding it? All of that is symbolic support or rejection of your particular position. So if you think, and I mean, it also goes down to emoticons, do people send you supportive emoticons, or do they send you kind of undermining, humiliating emoticons like the head slap? Now, if you think symbols didn't count for anything in Brian and Gabby's journey, and I mean, we are using that as a reference case for this discussion about self-esteem and the whole project of self-esteem as a path to or away from resilience, well, think again. From Gabby's tattoos to Brian Laundrie's books and art, both derived much of their self-referencing framework from these very symbols. In other words, it's not a mystery what symbols and symbolic reference system Gabby and Brian were kind of dipping into. You can see it, it's out there on their social media. So one doesn't have to be a psychology professor to see how both Gabby and Brian applied their symbolic frameworks to their lives and ultimately, to some extent, to their deaths. In the same way, I don't think one needs to be a psychology professor to look at your social media or to look at mine and look at the symbolic things that are resonating with us, which we obviously display. We make it explicit, the symbols that we identify with and want others who know us to similarly identify with. Gabby's tattoo, Let It Be, was essentially an unspoken theme governing the Moab stop. Think about it. Think about that tattoo and the way Gabby dealt with the Moab stop, which is all about let it be. Let Brian be. Let us be. Just forget that all of this happened. Just let us kind of continue on. And that is certainly was her psychology from her side of the road. Meanwhile, Brian's violent musings involving firearms and death were a kind of unacknowledged kind of backstory to who he was and what was going on in his heart and in his mind. And of course, all of that came home to roost, not only in terms of Gabby, but himself. In a way, he was consumed by his own violent fantasies.
Is that just the wind, or is that a furious vexation?
In Chapter 8 of Becker's tome, The Birth and Death of Meaning, a chapter titled Culture and Personality, he writes on page 75, quote, "If there is any doubt that self-esteem is the dominant motive of man, there would be one sure way to dispel it, and that would be by showing that when people do not have self-esteem, they cannot act, they break down." We see this with Gabby during the Moab stop and Brian shortly afterward. Again, if you're not quite sure what someone looks like, acts like, sounds like, who has no self-esteem, watch Wanted. Of course, Wanted also demonstrates the path out of no self-esteem, which is either the discovery, the rediscovery, or the construction of a new identity. Identity is to some extent fashioned via negotiated contract. We and others decide who we are, just as we and others tend to decide or agree or have some sort of consensus about who everyone around us is. And we see a little bit of that demonstrated in the movie Shrek, where the princess basically takes one form or another form, and then she's drawn in one particular direction over another.
The ogre has fallen in love with the princess. Oh, good Lord.
And so with that comes a certain allocation of approval or disapproval, and with that comes higher or lower levels of esteem. It's difficult to overemphasize the sparkling insight in Becker's assessment above, especially as it relates to true crime. I've already alluded to self-esteem being the crucial key in which to interrogate what happened to Gabby and Brian, but I probably need to emphasize the point even further. And if you really think about it, it is the key to understanding Rex Heuermann, Chad Daybell, every single personality, every character we encounter in true crime. True crime is, at its core, about motives. What happened, sure. What evidence leads us to believe certain events took place? Yes, certainly. And we kind of at that point in the Rex Heuermann case. But above all, why? Who is this person really? What is going on in their heart and mind? What drove the behaviors? Why did this tear in the fabric take place? What caused someone to break down? Which is what breaking the law, taking a life, invariably involves. So you and I might break down in a certain way, and there might be something destructive. We might shout. We might cancel plans or something like that. But with some individuals, when they break down, they break the law. They take somebody's life. And what causes that breakdown? Let's play Becker's assessment back again, this time slowly and in more digestible pieces. If there is any doubt that self-esteem is the dominant motive of man, let's break that down. What he's saying here is that the main force, the thing thrusting within the motive of man, the thing driving the whole train of existence, is self-esteem. It's the dominant force. It underlies the motive. That in itself, just that, is a huge insight. It's a tremendous epiphany, because what it reveals is that in all of true crime, the key to motive can be found in self-esteem. Brian Laundrie's self-esteem. Brian Koberger's self-esteem. Chris Watts's self-esteem, or lack of, which is to say, within the symbolic frameworks of a particular person. Becker also says, when people do not have self-esteem, they cannot act, they break down. In essence, what this means is all crimes, every time a law is broken, without exception, it has its source code in low self-esteem or in some self-esteem issue. Think about Alex Murdaugh. Think about Alec Baldwin. And I guess we should also see if this does apply to Amanda Knox. Other things too, doubtless, but primarily, fundamentally, this, self-esteem. If you're shaken by this, and you should be, because it truly has massive implications for a more sophisticated study and a more intimate understanding of the criminal mind, right? Then imagine what sort of inferences and intimations lie in wait for us beyond true crime. I mean, for us, in our own lives. I mean, for you, for me, for society as a whole. We realize in a sense that the fate of our species hangs on our collective self-esteem. And what is our collective self-esteem on D-Day, 80 years later? What was our collective self-esteem on D-Day 80 years ago? Where's our self-esteem taking us? We understand that we lose our way collectively, and now we know this is our way out, but also, if we're not careful, our way to ruin. In the movie Wanted, Wesley is presented with an identity, one which he assumes, and one which quickly establishes his real potential. But without the ability to properly fathom it, this identity, without the ability to properly discern its authenticity, or indeed lack of, this can be a dangerous dress rehearsal for delusions, manipulations, and if we're not careful, ultimately disaster. In other words, at this time that we infuse ourselves with self-esteem, are we not actually being poisoned? Are we not actually being tainted in some way with something that is good, something that is meant to be good, but is actually taking us on the wrong path? So we see it's not sufficient to merely assume an identity, even an identity that is almost right for us. It has to be authentic. This identity that we assume has to be authentic for the self-esteem to have real value, real meaning, and real power in terms of our ability to tap into our own efficacies. Now, if you're still not sure what all of this means, again, watch the film. But note that Wesley's identity is conferred to him by others. Yes, accepted by him, but essentially identity is, as Becker puts it, a social product. If this is disconcerting to consider, well, it should be. So, if having no self-esteem leads to breakdowns, regaining it authentically leads to breakthroughs. Of course, also regaining it inauthentically can also lead to breakdowns. Are you beginning to see why self-esteem is so quintessential? Becker writes, we must understand that self-esteem is vital. This is another way of saying that self-esteem is life when it is present, death when it is absent. A symbolic life and a symbolic death, but very real in terms of the lived experience, nevertheless. And what is really important to stress is my symbolic life and a criminal symbolic life may mean nothing to you. Rex Heuermann's symbolic life may be absolutely irrelevant to you, may not resonate, may not make sense. Brian Koberger's symbolic life may be strange and bizarre to you, but guess what? Your symbolic life absolutely makes sense to you. And so the key to understanding who you are from someone else's perspective is understanding your symbolic life. And the same applies to other people. The key to understanding me from your perspective is you understanding my symbolic life. The key to understanding a criminal like the suspect in the Long Island serial killer case is understanding his symbolic life. And who was he? He's an architect. He was a meticulous person who was preoccupied with details, but also something else was going on. Let's look at that word vital. Vital means absolutely necessary or important, essential, indispensable, necessary, needed. Can also mean full of energy, active, animated, spirited, energetic. In other words, those are all the things that self-esteem is. Necessary, essential, crucial, key. Now, I've touched very lightly on Becker's treatise on the subject. He takes it so much further. I mean, I've really read you maybe 5 sentences taken from entire chapters dealing with the subject. But I'm dealing with something where he expresses how we encounter one another with our exteriors, yet each of us walks about, as he puts it, with a great wealth of interior life, a private, secret self. And if you're thinking, wow, what does it actually mean? Think about Shrek. Think about how that starts off as a situation where exteriors interact. Meanwhile, there are very important and significant interiors taking place with regard to Shrek and Fiona. Fiona's actually someone else in a sense. Shrek also has another side to him, a softer side to him. Becker goes on to say that all objects have interiority, even trees, even donkeys. And then this. By the time we grow up, we become masters at dissimulation, at cultivating a self that the world cannot probe. But we pay a price. After years of turning people away, of protecting our inner self, of furnishing this world with fantasies and dreams, lo and behold, we find that we are hopelessly separated from everyone else. We have become victims of our own art. Those words apply to Rex Huerman. He cultivated a self that the world couldn't probe, but he pays a price for that. He turns people away, but then lo and behold, he finds himself hopelessly separated from everyone else. He's walking around seeing exteriors and he's desperate to get to know the interiors of other people. The blood, the meat, the life under the surface. Again, think of those words in the context of Gabby and Brian. Brian sees Gabby as the surface, but there's something going on underneath Gabby, just as there's something going on underneath Brian. We aren't surfaces. Perhaps this whole thing about interiority even applies to Vincent van Gogh. Think about those words. We have become victims of our own art. Perhaps as a writer and YouTuber who writes and YouTubes all the time, those words also extend to me. Becker continues, we touch people on the outsides of their bodies and they touch us, but we cannot get at their insides and cannot reveal our insides to them. Think about those words with regard to Rex Huerman, who feels like he wants a visceral, intimate experience, obviously not necessarily entirely in a altruistic or good way. There are twisted sides to that, sadistic impulses associated with that. But ultimately also he wants to get closer to the human experience. He feels outside of it and he wants to get inside of it. Becker goes on to say, often we want to say something unusually intimate to someone we care about, only for it to fall strangely and miserably flat. So what do we do? What do we do? How do we close this distance between ourselves and our fellow man and woman? How do you close this distance? Because there is a distance. Becker goes on to describe orgasm as a melting, but he adds, melting is not communication. Gabby and Brian may have felt they could bridge whatever distance was developing between them by melting together again and again, except to their dismay, the distance remained. And like a black hole, seemingly this distance was growing, was expanding. Becker refers to the endless interrogations where we try to use words to decipher one another, asking repeatedly, what are you thinking about right now? Do you feel what I feel? Do you love me? And in a real sense, the entirety of true crime is also endless interrogations about our fellow man. Who is someone really? Who are the people around us? Now, you may or may not have noticed that I presented the solution first in this analysis and then described the problem. If the problem is that we can't seem to access one another's or even our own respective interiorities, can't access it, can't understand it, well, the solution is to acknowledge our and one another's ultimate motives, our need for self-esteem. How do we do that? I've said, and it's a brief summary of it, we need to begin to understand and more than just glimpse one another's symbolic frameworks. In any event, I'm not going to take it further than that. We'll deal with how to acknowledge our own and others' self-esteem in the next analysis. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.
I said I don't know who I am.